The year was 1898, and the air in the hollows of West Virginia had a weight to it, a damp, clinging presence that promised cold winters and secrets kept as deep as the coal seams. For Alara Vance, returning after 5 years in the structured, soot-stained world of a Pittsburgh academy, the air felt heavier than she remembered. It was not merely the humidity of late summer, but something more profound, something that emanated from the very soil of her family's land. The Vance farm was, by all outward measures, a portrait of prosperity carved from the unforgiving Appalachian landscape. The main house stood proud, its white paint a stark denial of the encroaching wilderness. The fields were meticulously plotted, and the great, gray barn, the largest in the county, stood like a silent cathedral dedicated to labor and harvest. It was this barn that held the gravity of the place, its immense shadow stretching across the yard like a sundial marking the passage of grim, unhurried hours. Her father, Silas Vance, met her at the station, his presence as solid and unyielding as the mountains themselves. He was a man of reputation, a deacon in the church, his voice a low rumble that could soothe a nervous parishioner or command a stubborn mule with equal authority. The townsfolk of Hemlock Creek deferred to him, their greetings a mixture of respect and a caution that bordered on fear. Silas was the rock upon which their small community was built. He loaned money, brokered land deals, and offered work to the desperate souls who drifted through the mountains, men with no names and no futures. But as Alara rode beside him in the wagon, she saw a new hardness in the lines around his eyes, a possessive glint that she had been too young to recognize before. The farm, which had once been her entire world, now felt like a foreign country. The quiet was different. It was not the peace of isolation, but the taut, listening silence of a place holding its breath. The farmhands, men she had known since childhood, met her gaze for only a fleeting moment before looking away, their shoulders hunched as if against a constant, unseen wind. There was a current of unease that ran beneath the surface of daily chores, a shared, unspoken dread that made the crow of a rooster sound like a scream. What had happened here in her absence? What sickness had taken root behind the facade of pastoral order? The question was a splinter in her mind, and it pointed, always, toward the looming silhouette of the barn. It was the heart of the farm, the center of her father's domain. She remembered its familiar smells from childhood: sweet hay, dusty grain, the earthy scent of livestock. But now, a different odor seemed to cling to its weathered planks, a faint, metallic tang mixed with something sour and sad, like spoiled earth. Her father forbade her from entering it now. He claimed it was no place for a refined young woman, that the work was too rough, the animals too dangerous. It was an edict delivered with a gentle smile that did not reach his eyes, a paternal concern that felt more like a locked door. The barn had become his sanctuary, his fortress. In the evenings, long after the hands had retired to their bunkhouse, she would see the lonely flicker of his lantern moving within its cavernous dark, a solitary priest tending to some unknowable rite. The more he warned her away, the more the structure pulled at her, a silent, monolithic question mark against the darkening sky. It seemed to watch her, its hayloft window, like a single, unblinking eye. The locals whispered stories about the Vance farm, tales told in hushed tones over bar counters and sewing circles. They spoke of the unusual number of drifters and vagrants Silas hired, men who would appear for a season and then vanish without a word. The common explanation was that they were unreliable folk, prone to wandering off when the work got hard or they had earned enough for a bottle. It was a convenient truth, one that required no further thought. But Alara, now an outsider in her own home, saw the pattern with fresh, horrified eyes. She remembered names, faces. A man with a laugh like a rusty hinge, another who whittled small, delicate birds from scraps of wood. Where had they gone? Why did no one ask? The farm seemed normal, a testament to hard work and God's favor. But its normality was a carefully constructed lie, and Alara was beginning to see the terrifying, dark secret festering in the shadows of the great barn, a secret her own father guarded with the zeal of a serpent. Alara's days settled into a routine of strained domesticity. She helped her father's housekeeper, the perpetually frightened Mrs. Gable, with meals and mending, but the work felt hollow, a pantomime of a life that no longer fit. Her attempts at conversation were met with polite, empty responses. When she asked Mrs. Gable about a farmhand named Thomas, a young man with a limp who had written to his mother every week, the housekeeper's hands began to tremble. She dropped a dish, and the shattering sound echoed the fragility of the farm's composure. The woman claimed he had simply left, taken a better offer downriver. But her eyes, wide with a terror she could not voice, told a different story. The silence was a living entity, a suffocating blanket woven by the entire community. One Sunday, after a sermon in which her father spoke eloquently on the parable of the lost sheep, Elara approached the preacher, Reverend Michael, a man with soft hands and a face that seemed perpetually apologetic. She spoke of her concerns, of the men who seemed to dissolve into the mountain mist. The Reverend patted her arm, his expression one of condescending pity. He said, "Silas is a pillar of this community, my child. He offers charity to the undeserving, a chance for redemption through honest labor. It is the nature of such men to be transient. Their souls are restless. We must pray for them, not question the good deeds of those who try to help them." It was a dismissal cloaked in piety, a command to turn a blind eye. The message was clear. Silas Vance was beyond reproach. His good name was more valuable than the lives of a dozen nameless men. Her next stop was the town's sheriff, a portly, lethargic man named Brody who owed his position almost entirely to her father's influence. She found him sitting on the porch of his office, whittling a piece of wood into a crude animal shape. She presented her case more forcefully, listing the names she could remember, speaking of the unsettling quiet on the farm. Sheriff Brody listened, his knife never ceasing its slow, rhythmic work. When she finished, he sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice low and gravelly, "your father is a great man. He's brought order to this part of the county. Before him, this place was crawling with thieves and vagabonds. He gives them a choice: work or move on. Most move on." He held up the half-finished carving. It was a sheep. "Folks around here, we like the quiet," he added, his gaze pointed. "We don't go stirring up nests that are best left alone. You've been in the city too long. You've forgotten how things work out here." The threat, though veiled, was unmistakable. She was disturbing the peace, not by uncovering a crime, but by asking questions. She was the problem. The conspiracy was not a hidden plot. It was an open agreement, a social contract signed by every resident of Hemlock Creek. They had traded their curiosity, their conscience, for the security and prosperity that Silas Vance provided. The vanished men were the cost of that peace, a tithe paid to the mountain, and her father was the one who collected. The weight of this realization was crushing. She was utterly alone, an investigator with no allies, a daughter accusing an essay, every closed door, every evasive glance, every hollow platitude was another brick in the wall surrounding the barn. The community was not simply silent. It was a choir singing a hymn of ignorance, and her father was the conductor. That evening, as a storm gathered over the peaks, she watched from her window as a new man, thin and weary from the road, was led by her father toward the barn. Silas had his hand on the man's shoulder, a gesture of welcome that now looked predatory to Elara. The man disappeared into the deepening gloom of the barn's great maw, and the doors were pulled shut. The lantern was lit. Elara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would never see that man walk out again. The barn did not just house animals and grain. It consumed men. It was a stomach, and her father was the mouth. The farm's terrifying secret was not just that men disappeared, but that the entire world around them had agreed to pretend they never existed at all. Her official avenues exhausted, Elara was cast adrift in a sea of hostile silence. The faces in town were no longer just unfriendly. They were watchful, suspicious. She was the mad daughter, the ungrateful child chipping away at the foundations of their fragile world. Desperation led her down a path she had been warned against since she was a child, to a dilapidated cabin on the edge of the woods that bordered the Vance property. This was the home of Jebediah Thorne, once a deputy under Sheriff Brody, now the town pariah, a man who had traded his badge for a bottle and his reputation for rambling, drunken prophecies of doom. The children called him Mad Jeb. The adults simply called him a disgrace. Alara found him sitting on his porch, staring into the dense forest with vacant eyes, a jug of corn liquor resting by his side. He was a husk of a man, his face a roadmap of regret, his hands afflicted with a permanent tremor. He smelled of sour mash and old grief. When he saw her, a flicker of something, fear, recognition, crossed his face before being extinguished by a swig from a jug. She stood before him, a specter of the respectable world that had cast him out. Jebediah, she began, her voice steady despite the revulsion she felt at his state. I need to talk to you. About my father. About the farm. He let out a harsh, rasping laugh that turned into a cough. Silas Vance, he slurred, spitting onto the dusty ground. The great man. The saint of Hemlock Creek. What's there to talk about? Go to the church, daughter. He's got a sermon for everything. Alara did not move. She had expected this, the bitter shell he had grown around himself. I know something is wrong, she pressed. Men are going missing. I've been to the sheriff. I've been to the reverend. They told me to be quiet. They told me to pray. You're the only one left to ask. Jebediah looked at her then, his bloodshot eyes focusing with a startling clarity. He saw not the daughter of the man he feared, but a reflection of the same desperate truth-seeking that had ruined him. Quiet is good advice, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Quiet is how you stay alive in this valley. He took another long drink, shuddering as the liquor hit him. Alara took a step closer, her own desperation making her bold. They say you lost your nerve, she said, her tone softening. They say you saw something on a call one night out at our farm. Something that broke you. I don't believe you're a coward, Jebediah. I think you're a man with a conscience that's too heavy to carry. The words struck him like a physical blow. The jug slipped from his grasp, spilling its contents into the dirt. For a long moment, he was silent, his gaze fixed on the dark stain spreading at his feet. The facade of the drunken fool crumbled, revealing the haunted man beneath. A conscience, he rasped, is a luxury in a place like this. It's a stone that'll drown you. He finally looked up at her, his face a mask of anguish. It was 7 years ago. A boy ran into town, one of the seasonal hands. Said there was a fight at the Vance barn. Said a man was screaming. Brody sent me. He was busy. The memory made him tremble. When I got there, Silas met me in the yard. Calm as you please. Said it was just a couple of drunks got into it, and he'd sent the troublemaker packing. But I heard it, miss. Faintly, from inside the barn. It wasn't fighting. He paused, swallowing hard. It was weeping. A man's weeping from down below, from the ground itself. I asked him about it. He just smiled that cold smile of his and told me the barn had funny acoustics. Said the wind in the foundation can sound like a human voice. He looked at his shaking hands. Then he put a hand on my shoulder, and in the other, he had a roll of bills. Told me I was a good deputy, a sensible man. He said some things are best left to the wind. Brody backed him up, said I was hearing things. The next week, I was retired. For my health. He gave another bitter laugh. The whole town knew. They all knew what it meant, and they all looked the other way. He leaned forward, his voice a conspirator's whisper, raw and urgent. He's got a place down there, miss. Under the threshing floor. A false floor near the north wall, where they stack the old feed sacks. He thinks no one knows. But I saw the seams in the wood. I saw it. Don't go there. He's the devil himself, dressed in farmer's clothes. The confession hung in the air, a terrible gift. It was the crack in the wall she had been searching for, the first solid piece of ground in a swamp of lies. It had cost Jebediah everything, and now he had passed the burden of that knowledge to her. The disgraced deputy's words were a compass pointing toward damnation. A false floor, weeping from the ground. The north wall. These fragments of a 7-year-old horror became Alara's new scripture, the gospel of a truth that had been purposefully buried. The fear that had been a cold knot in her stomach now sharpened into a blade of cold resolve. She had to see. She had to know. For the next 2 days, she watched her father's routine, mapping the rhythms of the farm with the precision of a general planning an assault. She learned the exact hour he left for his weekly supply run to the next town, a journey that would grant her a window of at least 4 hours. She noted the comings and goings of the few remaining farmhands, men whose fear made them predictable. They would not go near the barn unless Silas was present. It was his sanctum, and they treated it with the superstitious reverence of peasants before a dragon's lair. The barn, which she had once played in as a child, now loomed in her imagination as a place of monstrous architecture, a structure with a secret and diseased anatomy. On the third day, the day of the supply run, she watched from her bedroom window as his wagon rumbled down the long dirt track, disappearing into the haze of the valley. The farm fell into its customary taut silence. Mrs. Gable was kneading dough in the kitchen, her movements slow and rhythmic, a metronome counting down Alara's stolen time. Alara slipped out the back of the house, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The air in the yard was still and heavy. The short walk to the barn felt like crossing a desolate, exposed plain. The massive double doors were barred from the outside with a heavy wooden beam, but she knew of a smaller, secondary door on the side, one her father never used. Its iron hinges screamed in protest as she pulled it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. She slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind her, and was plunged into a world of shadows and dust motes dancing in the slanted columns of light that pierced the gloom. The air was thick with the familiar sense of hay and earth, but beneath them, that other smell was stronger now, undeniable. It was the smell of sickness, of unwashed bodies and human despair, a fetid undercurrent that the clean scent of the farm could not mask. She moved cautiously, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. The barn was a cavern of organized labor. Tools hung neatly on the walls, scythes, pitchforks, axes, their edges glinting faintly. Sacks of feed and seed were stacked high. But it was the north wall that drew her, the area Jebediah had described. It looked like any other part of the barn. Old, empty feed sacks were piled against the wall, seemingly at random. A discarded plow lay nearby, covered in a fine layer of dust. Nothing looked out of place. Nothing looked disturbed. Her hope began to curdle into despair. Had the old drunk been wrong? Was this another dead end? She began to move the sacks, her hands quickly becoming coated in a film of grime and mold. They were heavy, awkward. Beneath them, the floorboards were like any other. She ran her hands over them, searching for the seams Jebediah had mentioned. She pushed, she pulled, she knelt and peered at the gaps between the planks. Nothing. The silence pressed in, amplifying the sound of her own frantic breathing. And then her fingers brushed against it. A small, almost imperceptible notch in the side of one of the boards. It was not a natural imperfection in the wood. It was carved. Her fingers traced its outline, and she realized it was a handle designed to be almost invisible. She hooked her fingers into it and pulled. The board resisted, then lifted with a groan of dry, protesting wood. It was not a single board, but a small, cleverly disguised panel. Beneath it was not a latch or a handle, but a simple iron ring set flush into a much larger section of the floor. It was the door, but as she gripped the ring, her relief was immediately replaced by a new obstacle. A heavy, formidable padlock, its iron body pitted with rust, secured the ring to a thick bolt set deep into the adjoining beam. It was a lock meant not to keep thieves out, but to keep something terrible in. The key. Where would a man like her father hide such a key? A man of order, of secrets, of piety. Not in the barn. That was too obvious. It would be close to him. It would be hidden in plain sight. Her mind raced back to his study, the one room in the house that was as much his fortress as the barn. The room with its imposing desk, its shelf of leather-bound account books, and in the center of it all, the heavy family Bible. The answer struck her with the force of a physical blow. She fled the barn, leaving the pile of sacks and the exposed ring, a desecration she prayed he would not notice. Back in the house, she found the study empty. The Bible lay on its lectern, a monument to her father's righteousness. With trembling hands, she opened it. Tucked not within the pages of Genesis or Psalms, but within the fire and brimstone of Revelations, was a small, flat, iron key. It was cold to the touch, and it felt heavier than any key had a right to be. The weight of the iron key in her palm was the weight of complicity, of knowledge that could not be unknown. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood, and time was running out. She returned to the barn, the house key clutched in her hand, the Bible key a cold secret in her pocket. The air inside the vast structure seemed colder now, more menacing. The columns of light had weakened, and the shadows in the corners had deepened, coalescing into shapes that played tricks on the eye. She knelt again at the exposed trapdoor, the smell of the earth and something far worse rising to meet her. The key slid into the padlock with a grating sound. For a heart-stopping moment, it refused to turn, the mechanism seized by years of rust and disuse. She applied more pressure, her knuckles white, her breath held tight in her chest. With a final, agonizing shriek of metal on metal, the lock sprang open. She pulled it free, its weight a sudden, shocking release. The iron ring felt cold and final in her hand. Taking a deep breath, she heaved the trapdoor upward. It was immensely heavy, a solid slab of wood reinforced with iron, and it opened with a groan that seemed to echo from the very bowels of the earth. A wave of putrid air washed over her, a stench so vile and overwhelming that she gagged, stumbling back. It was the smell of a tomb, of human waste, of sickness, and of profound, bottomless despair. It was the smell of men being kept like animals. Peering into the abyss, she saw a crude wooden ladder leading down into absolute blackness. There was no light, only the sound. A low, collective moan, the rustle of straw, the faint, rhythmic clinking of chain. It was the sound Jebediah had heard 7 years ago, the sound of weeping from the ground. Her courage almost failed her. Every instinct screamed at her to slam the door shut, replace the lock, and flee. To run from this place and never look back. But the image of the thin, weary man her father had led into this barn just nights before flashed in her mind. The image of the man who whittled birds. She could not leave them. Steeling herself, she took the lantern she had brought, its flame a pitifully small weapon against the oppressive dark. She hooked it to her belt, took hold of the ladder's rough-hewn rungs, and began her descent. The ladder was slick with some unidentifiable dampness. The darkness swallowed her whole. With each step down, the stench intensified, coating the back of her throat. The sounds grew louder, more distinct. A man coughed, a wet, ragged sound of death. Another sobbed quietly, a continuous, hopeless lament. When her feet touched the damp earth floor, she raised the lantern. The light pushed back the darkness in a small, trembling circle, revealing a scene from an artisan of hell's worst imaginings. She was in a long, narrow cellar, no more than 5 feet high, forcing her to stoop. The walls were rough-hewn stone, weeping with moisture. Along both sides of the narrow corridor were crude cells, their bars fashioned from thick branches and rusted iron implements. And inside them were the men. They were wraiths, skeletal figures in rags, their faces obscured by matted hair and beards. Some lay on thin pallets of filthy straw, too weak to move. Others sat with their backs against the wall, their eyes vacant and dull in the lantern light. Most were shackled, a heavy chain running from a manacle on their ankle to a thick iron ring bolted into the stone wall. They blinked at the light, not with hope, but with the slow, uncomprehending indifference of creatures who had forgotten the sun. There were perhaps a dozen of them in the dim light, but the cellar stretched further into the darkness. How many more were there? The air was thick with their suffering. It was a library of pain, and each man was a volume of untold misery. She saw an old man with a face like a dried apple, his lips moving in a silent prayer. In another cell, a younger man, barely more than a boy, rocked back and forth, humming a tuneless, frantic melody. This was her father's harvest. This was the true product of the Vance farm. Not corn, not wheat, but human suffering. He was not a farmer. He was a collector of souls. As she moved deeper, her light fell upon a small alcove carved between two of the cells. In it, tucked beneath a loose stone near the floor, was a small object wrapped in oilcloth. It was not part of the filth and decay. It had been hidden with purpose. With trembling fingers, she reached in and drew out. Unwrapping the cloth, she found a small, leather-bound book, its pages warped by the damp. A diary, the testament of this place. The last will of a man condemned to this earthen grave. The leather of the small book was cold and clammy, like the skin of a corpse. Alaris sank to the damp ground, the lantern beside her casting long, dancing shadows that made the cellar's inhabitants look like frantic, tormented ghosts. The prisoners watched her, their eyes hollow points of light in the gloom, their silence more profound than any scream. She opened the book. The handwriting on the first page was elegant, the script of a man of education, starkly out of place in this subterranean hell. The ink was faded, but the words were a clear, defiant cry from the past. The entry was dated 2 years prior. October 12, 1896, it began. My name is Arthur Penhaligon. I write this not with any real hope of its discovery, but because to cease writing would be to surrender the last part of myself that is still mine. I was a teacher once in a life that now seems a distant dream. Circumstances found me on the road, seeking work to send back to my wife, Eleanor. It was then that I met him, Silas Vance. He found me on the road to Hemlock Creek, my shoes worn through, my stomach empty. He spoke with the voice of a prophet, his eyes full of a righteous fire. He offered me not charity, but opportunity, a place to work, good pay, a roof over my head. He spoke of the dignity of labor, of earning one's bread by the sweat of one's brow. He seemed a savior, an answer to a prayer I had been too proud to utter. I saw him as a giant among men, a true Christian in a faithless world. How blind I was! Alara's hand trembled as she turned the page, the thin paper rustling loudly in the charged silence. Arthur's entries chronicled his first few weeks on the Vance farm with a heartbreaking optimism. He wrote of the good food, the hard but satisfying work, and the charisma of his new employer. He described Silas leading the farmhands in prayer before every meal, his voice a deep, reassuring bass that spoke of order and divine purpose. But a thread of unease soon began to weave its way through the hopeful prose. October 28th, one entry read, "There is a strangeness here. The other hands are a quiet, watchful lot. They speak little and never of the world outside this valley. When I speak of my wife, they look away. It is as if they have forgotten they ever had lives before this farm. Last night, one of the men, a fellow named John, had a coughing fit that lasted near an hour. This morning, he is gone. Mr. Vance said he was too ill to work and had to be sent away for his own good. But he left without his pack, without the pay he was owed. No one has spoken his name all day." The narrative began its inexorable slide into dread. Arthur, with his teacher's observant mind, started to notice the discrepancies, the things that did not add up, the tools that would go missing and then reappear, the way Silas would speak of the men not as employees, but as acquisitions in his farm ledger. The true turning point came a week later. November 5th. I have discovered the truth. It is a truth so monstrous that my hand shakes to write it. I was in the barn late, mending a harness by lantern light. I dropped my needle, and it rolled between the floorboards. As I knelt to retrieve it, I saw it. A glint of iron where there should be only wood. A ring. My curiosity, the trait my dear Eleanor always said would be my undoing, got the better of me. I found the lock, and I saw my employer, Silas Vance, lead a new man, a poor soul, from the road, not to the bunkhouse, but to this very spot. I hid in the hayloft, my heart a stone in my chest. I watched as he opened the floor and forced the man down into the darkness below. The man did not scream. He begged, and Silas laughed. He told him that he was now home, that his worthless life would finally have purpose. He was no longer a man, but stock, The horror of the revelation was a cold weight in Alara's own chest. She was reading the story of her own discovery, told by one of the first to live it. The final entry before a long gap was scribbled frantically, the elegant script devolving into a panic scrawl. November 6th. He knows. I do not know how, but he knows I saw. His eyes on me today were different. They were not the eyes of a benevolent farmer. They were the eyes of a collector studying a new specimen. He has asked me to meet him in the barn after supper to discuss my future on the farm. I'm hiding this book. If you are reading this, you are where I am about to be. Do not trust the shepherd. He is a wolf, and we're the sheep for his slaughter. Tell Eleanor I love her. The next page was blank, and the one after that. Alara felt a sob rise in her throat. She was holding the last words of a dead man, a ghost testimony written in a living tomb. She looked up from the book at the gaunt faces watching her and saw them not as a wretched mass, but as a collection of Arthurs, of Thomases, of Johns. Each one had a name, a life, a story that ended here in the cold, stinking dark beneath her father's barn. The diary did not end there. After several blank pages, the writing resumed, but it was a different hand, a different voice. The script was rougher, less practiced, but filled with a desperate clarity. It was as if Arthur's chronicle had been passed from one dying man to another, a shared testament of the damned. Alara turned the page, her fingers tracing the new, jagged letters. My name is Peter. The entry began undated. Arthur is gone. The master took him 2 nights ago. His cough had grown bad, and the master said he was a weakness in the stock. He did not come back. Before he was taken, he gave me this book. He said the story must be told. He said we are not animals. The entries that followed painted a grim, methodical portrait of life in the cellar. Peter was not a man of letters like Arthur. His descriptions were blunt, stark, and all the more horrifying for it. He wrote of the routine. The master, as they were forced to call Silas, would descend once a day. He never came empty-handed. In one hand, he carried a bucket of thin, watery gruel, barely enough to sustain life, which he would slop into wooden troughs. In the other, he carried his Bible. Before they were allowed to eat, he would read to them. He chose passages of damnation, of punishment, of the unworthiness of man. He would stand before their cells, his voice booming in the confined space, and preach to them about their sins. He called them vagrants, drunkards, the idle refuse of a decent society. He told them that their lives outside his care had been meaningless, but here, in his service, they had found purpose. They were no longer a burden. They were tools. He tells us we are blessed, Peter wrote, his fury palpable even in the crude script. He says this cellar is a monastery, and our labor is a prayer. He says the pain purifies us. He is mad. He is a devil who has memorized scripture. The labor was the cruelest part of the design. Each morning, a few of the healthier men would be unshackled and led up into the barn. They were worked from before dawn until after dusk, performing the most back-breaking tasks on the farm, clearing stones from new fields, digging irrigation ditches, mucking out the deepest stalls. They were worked until they collapsed, then dragged back to the cellar and chained to the wall. The men were not paid. They were not fed any more than the others. Their labor was simply an assertion of Silas's absolute dominion. He was not just imprisoning them. He was using them, wringing every last drop of life and labor from their bodies before discarding the husk. It was a model of perfect, monstrous efficiency. Peter's entries became a grim catalog of the men who shared his fate. He listed their names, their professions, where they were from. A blacksmith from Ohio, a young farmer from Pennsylvania who had lost his land, a soldier who had returned from the war with a shattered spirit. Each name was a small act of defiance, a refusal to let them be forgotten. The entries grew more sporadic as the weeks, or perhaps months, wore on. Time had no meaning in the endless dark. The boy in the end cell has stopped humming. One short entry read, "He just stares at the wall. I think he has forgotten his own name." Another read, "David tried to fight back today. He threw his bowl at the master. The master did not get angry. He smiled. He said pride was the devil's favorite sin. He took David up to the barn. We heard the screams for a long time. They brought him back broken. He cannot walk now. Alara felt a wave of nausea. This was her father, the man who had taught her to read, who had held her hand on the way to church, who had praised her good grades at the academy. That man was a fiction. The true man was this monster. This systematic torturer who used the word of God as a whip. The diary's final entry was short, the handwriting shaky. My strength fails. The dampness has gotten into my lungs. It is hard to breathe. I give this book to Samuel. He is strong. He is from the mountains. He does not speak much, but his eyes are full of hate. The master does not see it. He thinks we are all broken. But hate can keep a man alive when hope is gone. Samuel will watch. He will wait. Alara closed the book. The lantern flame flickered, and for a moment, she thought it would go out, leaving her in the total darkness with the ghosts and the waiting. She looked at the faces in the cells again. One man, powerfully built despite his emaciation, met her gaze. His eyes were not vacant. They were burning with a cold, patient fire. It was Samuel. He had been watching her read. He knew what she held in her hands. The book was not just a record of the past. It was a weapon for the future. It was a promise of vengeance passed from a dying hand to a living one. And now, that promise had been passed to her. Rising from the dirt floor, her body aching from the cold and the stooped posture, Alara felt as if she had aged a decade in the span of an hour. The diary was a lead weight in her hand, its contents a poison in her soul. She was no longer just a daughter who suspected her father of some unnamed evil. She was a witness, a keeper of the dead men's stories. The path forward was no longer a question of if, but how. The law was a closed door, a deaf ear. Sheriff Brody was her father's man, the town his congregation. To bring this book to them would be to sign her own death warrant, and perhaps be condemned to this very cellar. She had to confront the monster herself. She ascended the ladder, leaving the world of chains and shadows behind, and emerged back into the familiar space of the barn. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows through the slats in the walls. The familiar smells of hay and home were now tainted, forever corrupted by the stench that clung to her clothes and hair. She carefully replaced the trapdoor, the wood settling into its hidden groove with a soft thud. She scattered the feed sacks back over the spot, her movements clumsy in her haste. She had to believe it would be enough to hide her transgression, at least for a while. She returned to the house, a ghost in her own home. Her father had not yet returned. She went to her room and hid the diary, wrapping it in cloth and placing it at the very bottom of her travel trunk, a silent bomb ticking beneath her starched blouses and academy textbooks. When she heard the rumble of his wagon in the yard, her body went rigid. She forced herself to go downstairs, to greet him as a daughter should. He entered the kitchen, his face ruddy from the evening air, his presence filling the room, diminishing everything else within it. He smiled at her, the same paternal smile she had seen her whole life, but now she saw it for the mask it was. It was the smile of the wolf in the pasture. "A good trip," he announced, handing a small bag of candy to a grateful Mrs. Gable. "The Lord has blessed us with a fine season." He turned his gaze to Alara, and his smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "You look pale, daughter. Is the country air not to your liking?" It was a test. His eyes, those cold, observant collector's eyes, were searching her face for any sign of betrayal, any crack in her composure. "I'm just tired, Father," she managed, her voice a thin, reedy thing she barely recognized as her own. The quiet takes some getting used to after the city. For the next few days, she played the part of the dutiful, obedient daughter. She attended to her chores. She sat through his long, pious dinner graces. She listened to his pronouncements on scripture and morality. But it was a waking nightmare. Every word he spoke about charity, about sin, about redemption, was a dagger in her ear. She saw Arthur's words superimposed over his face. She heard the weeping from the ground in the pauses between his sentences. One evening, she decided to force the confrontation, to see the full face of his monstrosity. They were in his study. He had his desk poring over his ledgers, she mending a tear in one of his shirts. "Father," she began, her voice carefully neutral. Sheriff Brody mentioned that you provide a great service to the community, taking in men who have nowhere else to go. It must be a heavy burden. Silas looked up, setting down his pen. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. It was not the fatherly smile. It was the master's smile. The Lord's work is never a burden, Alara. It is a privilege. We are commanded to be shepherds. And some are born to be led. They are weak, without purpose. They would perish in the wilderness. I provide them with a fold. I give them purpose. His gaze was intense, unwavering. He was not just answering her question. He was gauging her, testing the waters. But some of them leave so suddenly, she pressed, the needle in her hand poised over the cloth. Mrs. Gable worries for them. Worry is a failure of faith, he said, his voice dropping to a low, confessional tone. Their purpose here is fulfilled, and they are sent on their way. The world is a better place for their absence. They are a blight, Alara, a disease. I'm not a jailer. I am a physician, curing the land of its sickness. I am doing what men like your Sheriff Brody are too weak to do. He was confessing. He was justifying an atrocity as if it were a civic duty, a holy crusade. He believed his own vile gospel. He saw her not as an accuser, but as a potential convert, an heir to his dark ministry. He leaned forward, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. You have my blood in you. You have my strength. I have seen the way you look at this place, the way you see the weakness in others. You understand order. You understand purpose. This farm, this work, it will all be yours one day. You are the only one worthy of it. The offer hung in the air, sickening and obscene. He was not just a monster. He wanted to make her one, too. He was inviting her into the cellar, not as a prisoner, but as a guard. In his twisted vision of the world, this was her inheritance, a kingdom built on the bones of forgotten men. The monstrous proposition lingered in the study's stale air, a poison that sought to turn her own blood against her. He saw her silence not as horror, but as contemplation. He believed her capable of becoming his heir, of perpetuating his reign of sanctimonious cruelty. In that moment, Alara's fear was burned away by a cold, clarifying rage. Her father was not just a murderer and a torturer. He was a corrupter, a man who sought to remake the world in his own monstrous image, starting with his own daughter. She had to end it, not just for the men in the cellar, but for herself, for the memory of the person she was before she came home. No, she said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the room with the force of a thrown stone. Silas's smile vanished. His face, for the first time, lost its mask of pious control, revealing the raw, possessive fury beneath. No, he repeated, his voice a low growl. You are my daughter. You will do as you are told. You will earn your place. My place is not in hell with you, she retorted, her voice gaining strength. She stood up, letting the shirt she was mending fall to the floor. I know what is in the barn. I have seen them. I have read Arthur's words. The mention of the name, a name Silas had likely long forgotten, struck him like a physical blow. The blood drained from his face, replaced by a dark, mottled flush of pure rage. He rose from his desk, his large frame seeming to suck all the air from the room. The benevolent farmer was gone, replaced by the predator she had read about, the master of the cellar. You foolish, ungrateful girl, he hissed, his voice thick with venom. You went into my barn? You touched what is mine. He took a step toward her, his hands clenching and unclenching. I gave you everything. An education, a name, and you repay me with this betrayal? You are weak, just like your mother was. Sentimental. You see men where I see only beasts of burden. You see tragedy where I see order. He advanced on her, his eyes burning with a terrifying fire. But you can be taught. You will learn the lesson of obedience, just as they have. You will have a place among them. You will see the world from the dirt, and you will understand. He was going to lock her in the cellar. The thought was so horrifying, so absolute, that it paradoxically cleared her mind. This was the final confrontation. There would be no escape, no negotiation. It was his will or hers. But she had not come to this confrontation unprepared. While he had been at his ledgers, she had been making her own plans. She knew she could not overpower him. She knew the diary alone was not enough. The town was his. The law was his. Justice in this valley had to be of a different, more primal sort. As he lunged for her, she darted to the side, toward the fireplace. His large hand snagged the sleeve of her dress, and the fabric ripped with a harsh, tearing sound. She stumbled, but did not fall. "The men are waiting, father," she said, her voice loud and clear, projecting toward the open study window. It was a signal. Earlier that evening, while he had been in the fields, she had returned to the cellar. She had not gone with food or water. She had gone with a promise. Using the heavy iron bolt from the barn door as a lever, she had worked at the ancient, rusted hinges of the cell doors. She had weakened them, preparing them, and she had spoken to the one man whose eyes held the fire of rebellion, Samuel. She had told him to listen for her voice. Now, as Silas grabbed for her again, a new sound entered the night. It was a low, splintering groan from the direction of the barn, followed by a chorus of guttural, inhuman cries. It was the sound of rusted iron giving way, of desperate men tasting freedom for the first time in years. Silas froze, his head cocked, listening. A look of disbelief, then fury, crossed his face. "What have you done?" he roared, turning from her and striding toward the window. He looked out into the moonlit yard and saw them. A dozen specters, wraiths of men, pouring from the side door of the barn. They were gaunt and unsteady, but they were armed. They carried the tools of the farm, the scythes, the pitchforks, the heavy mallets, their implements of torture now turned into weapons of vengeance. At their head was Samuel, his powerful frame moving with a grim, unstoppable purpose. Silas turned back to Alara, his face a mask of utter hatred. "You have unleashed chaos. You have undone my work. I have delivered your judgment," she said, her voice cold and steady. "You preached to them of sin and damnation. You told them they were beasts. Now, the beasts have come for their shepherd." She did not wait for his response. She did not want to see the harvest she had sown. While his attention was fixed on the approaching horde, she slipped out of the study, through the back of the house, and into the darkness of the woods. Behind her, she heard the front door of the house splintering open. She heard her father's roar of rage, followed by the collective, vengeful cry of the men he had caged. She did not look back. She walked away from the light of the house, away from the sounds of a terrible, biblical reckoning, and let the night swallow her whole. The darkness of the Appalachian forest became her sanctuary. Alara walked without stopping, fueled by adrenaline and a hollow sense of finality. The sound from the farmhouse faded behind her, replaced by the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth and the sighing of the wind through the hemlocks. She did not know where she was going, only that she was moving away, away from the Vance farm, away from Hemlock Creek, away from a name that was now synonymous with a horror she herself had unleashed. She walked through the night, and when the sun rose, its gentle light seemed like a sacrilege against the darkness she carried within her. She was the sole survivor of a war she had started, the lone witness to a justice that no court would ever recognize. She never returned. She never learned the precise, gruesome details of what transpired in the house that night. She didn't need to. She had seen the look in Samuel's eyes. She had felt the weight of the pitchforks and scythes. She had unleashed years of pent-up agony and hatred, and she knew that such a force, once freed, would not be gentle in its work. The story, as it eventually filtered out from the mountains, was a fractured, whispered thing. Travelers spoke of a fire, a great and terrible blaze that consumed the Vance farm in a single night. The house, the outbuildings, and the great gray barn were all reduced to a mound of blackened timbers and ash. Of Silas Vance, there was no trace. He had simply vanished. The official explanation, provided by a visibly shaken Sheriff Brody, was that Silas had been the victim of a tragic accident, perhaps a lantern overturned in the barn. As for the dozen or so farmhands who had also disappeared, they were dismissed as drifters who had fled the fire, likely having stolen what they could before they ran. No investigation was ever conducted. No one from outside Hemlock Creek came to ask the difficult questions. The fire was an act of God, a convenient erasure of a story the town had no desire to tell. The conspiracy of silence did not break. It simply found a new, deeper grave in which to bury its secrets. The ash of the Vance farm was folded into the soil, and a new, more potent quiet settled over the valley. But the land remembered. The fields that had been so meticulously cultivated were soon reclaimed by weeds and briars. The prosperity that Silas Vance had brought to the region seemed to wither with his memory. The town of Hemlock Creek began a slow, inexorable decline, as if the poison that had been concentrated in the barn cellar had seeped into the water table, sickening the entire community from its roots. The farm became a blighted place, a scar on the landscape that locals would point to from a distance. It became the source of new ghost stories, tales of spectral flames, and the sound of weeping on the wind. The truth of the men in the cellar, of Arthur's diary, of Alara's terrible choice, was lost, subsumed into the regional folklore of haunted places and mountain devils. Alara Vance lived the rest of her life under a different name in a city far to the west. She never married. She never had children. She carried the memory of the cellar within her, a private, lightless space in her own soul. Was what she did justice? Or was it revenge? Had she liberated the oppressed? Or had she merely become a different kind of monster, one who sacrifices her father to a pack of wolves? The questions were a constant, silent companion. She had not sought a trial or a conviction. She had sought a reckoning, and the reckoning that came was as primal and brutal as the crimes it was meant to punish. She had chosen not the law of man, but the more ancient law of the mountains, an eye for an eye, a life for a life. In the end, the story of Silas Vance's barn is not a story of good triumphing over evil, but a far more unsettling tale about the nature of silence, the price of peace, and the terrible deeds that can be done in the name of order. It is a testament to the darkness that can fester behind a righteous facade, and a grim reminder that sometimes the only way to expose a secret is to burn it all to the ground, leaving nothing behind but ash and whispers.